It'll be like a couple days after I sign it. If I do it tonight, it would be like Thursday.
I'm having surgery on Thursday.
Well, I mean, if you have there's always, when people have special conditions or issues like that, we can always take care of it. I'm not, I don't know if you know anything about me, but I don't think anyone's ever said I'm a hard ass. Many other things, but jackass, I'm a hard ass. All right. What I want to do, and I'm kind of glad we met last Thursday, the Thursday before Christmas, because it enabled me to kind of get to a place where I want to go. I mean, my goal is to get through a bunch of stuff this week, so next week we can basically spend most of our time talking about the 60s. I think is more interesting to most folks. We've been talking about civil rights and the anti-war movement and the hippies and all that kind of stuff, all right? But I want to kind of continue this because I think it is important, Tommy, to kind of give you the whole picture, this whole context. And like I said, I do plan on making this a regular 15-week class. And also along with that, at the end of the semester, I really would appreciate your input on like how to do that, what works, what doesn't, that kind of thing. These courses, last winter I taught my first one, and I actually taught a mini version of a class I've already been teaching, and they're really different. And so I'm doing it in verse. This time I'm doing a class that I haven't done before. So when it comes time to turning this into a regular 15-week class, I really would appreciate any ideas or any thoughts you have on how it works. All right. Up to this point, we've got about as far as 1900, actually into the World War I era. I think the last thing I did was we talked about the Triangle Fire and the repression of radicals and so forth. And I want to kind of go back a little bit and talk about some other turn of the century stuff. But for the most part, you could say I think we're up to around 1900. All right. First off, any questions about any of the content we've covered? All right. What themes? I mean, there's a couple dominant themes I think you see here. What are they? Maybe more than a couple. But what like big ideas? When we discuss this stuff, most of it there's kind of these similarities. Yeah.
The prevalence of class warfare.
Prevalence of class. So, and you see that fairly early on, right? From Bacon's Rebellion all the way to Paxton's and then the Tea Party and all that. At the same time, there are these anti-colonial issues. There's always this issue of who should rule at home, which is a nice way of putting it. So there's clearly always been class in the United States. And I think this is an important historical, subject, but it's also a corrective because we tend to live in an era where we deny that, where we pretend there's no class, or if you listen to political campaigns, everybody's in the middle class, right? And especially now, what we're seeing with the meltdowns in the last few years is that class politics are resurging, especially with things like the Occupy movement. So yeah, there's always been this class element and class struggle. Okay, what else?
Suffrage movements.
What's that?
Voting, suffrage.
There's voting and suffrage movements that becomes important. We saw that like in the 1800s with like the Doors Rebellion, and that's going to become really important again, obviously, with the Civil Rights Movement. So there are these movements that want economic equality, but then there are basic movements for fundamental political rights as well, right? And we didn't spend a lot of time talking on like slave rebellions or Native Americans, but those would fit into that as well, obviously. They're kind of more political movements. But when we talk about the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, that's going to be a huge issue. What else? How are these, yeah.
A question from the back.
Exactly, you read my mind. I was going to say how these movements dealt with. And so you also see government responses, state responses, and generally very oppressive state responses, and often very violent state responses. So the mechanisms of the state, whether it be the army, the courts, the laws, will clearly work against the ability of people to organize and to collectively express these grievances. So it's real hard, it's real difficult, and I think at the end, when we kind of wrap all this up, you'll probably hear somewhat a more discouraging historical view of what all this means than you might otherwise. I know. But if you read Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, it's kind of the gold plate special. I mean, that's kind of, in a lot of ways, what really brought a lot of people into studying these kinds of things. And it was in the 60s, a lot of people started doing what they call history from the bottom up. So rather than focus on the kings or the presidents or whatever, you looked at average people, and I think there's real utility and value to that, and I've been influenced by that. At the same time, I think there's a tendency to romanticize that, and you know, look at what the people did. The people did this. The people did that, and which is incredibly valuable, and I cherish it. But at the same time, at the end of the day, these oppressive mechanisms of the state tend to get their way, and they tend to win out. And even when there is fundamental change, as is with the civil rights movement, it tends to be channeled into fairly safe ways. So when you get successful reform, it tends to be reform that the ruling class is willing to live with, or may even want. You know, in a lot of places, the ruling class will actually be the catalyst for reform, because what it does is it rationalizes and harmonizes a system. If you can reform something and tweak it around the edges, then you're probably not going to have radical, angry reform that's going to call for a restructure. And this is what to look for in the next, you know, in the coming days and months and years with the Occupy movement. Is there going to be a successful attempt to kind of soften this movement and preempt it? Because right now what you're seeing in a lot of ways is an anti-capitalist movement, which is really striking. People are talking about capitalism. They want, a lot of these folks want some kind of a fundamental restructuring of the system. So are we going to have that? Or are we going to see some kind of, like, the ruling class is going to say, hey, we do need to fix this up. We need to structure it, you know, clean it up a little, soften up the edges, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's going to be the question, and that's an eternal question. All right, so that's good. I mean, you've kind of got it. Those are the kind of main themes. I think there's peripheral stuff, and we could go into details, of course, but those are the main ideas, right? And we've seen that all the way through. And what you see then in the late 1800s is the emergence of labor wars and labor violence. And that's kind of the traditional model, right? That's what Marx talked about. That's what people in the United States feared. And during the Pullman strike, I believe, Richard Olney, who would later be Secretary of State and Attorney General, said, our founders went too far with their notions of democracy. Law and order has now become the victim of freedom, or something along those lines. I don't know the exact words, but that's the exact message. And remember, I told you at the very beginning, there was this fear of democracy. Why do you have a representative democracy in the United States? I mean, what kind of democracy do you have? If something needs to get done, can you directly redress your grievances to the people in charge? Can you go to the Senate or the Congress or the White House and do it on your own? You have to do it through somebody else, and who do you have to do it through?
Lobbyists.
But you're elected representatives, right? The law, and then that's the fact too. That you don't even do that; you do it through lobbies, right? So it's not a direct democracy; it's a representative democracy. And in that representative democracy, your role as a direct participant is negated, actually. And again, in the '60s, we'll talk about that, because that becomes a major theme. I mean, if there's any particular legacy of that, is this idea about participatory democracy rather than this representative democracy. Because in a representative democracy, you know, you have to go through Tom DeLay or whoever, Sheila Jackson Lee or whoever, Corin, you know, Rick Perry. You know, they're the ones, you know, if you have a problem, you're not supposed to take it upon yourself to do that. You need to go through them. In the early 1970s, there was a huge spike in the price of meat, and typical American housewives, not exactly radicals, you know, not exactly Jane Fonda and Susan Sarandon types, started a meat boycott. They were going to quit buying beef because the price was too high. And the people in charge were very upset at this, and Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president at the time, was very upset. He said, these women are becoming radical. What you should be doing is writing letters to your congressman to complain about the high price of beef, but keep buying it, you know, but complain about it through the channels. And so that's kind of the issue that you're going to see. These people will always try to channel dissent and discontent into very safe ways, right? What I want to talk about today then is kind of the counter. The main theme, I think the main theme in terms of protest in this era would be kind of these labor protests and the repressions and the tragedies, you know, from Haymarket and Homestead, all that stuff, Ludlow, the Bisbee deportation, which I think I mentioned, the Triangle Fire, all right? At the same time, there's a couple other major movements, anti-imperialism and agrarian radicalism, and I want to kind of fairly quickly go through those today. Anti-imperialism, and again, as we get further along, that'll become more important. if I ask you to mention the 1960s, a word association game, tell me something about the 60s. What do you say?
Anti-war.
Anti-war,
Peace movement.
peace movement, civil rights. I mean, there's the cool things, but any war, Vietnam is generally going to come up there. Right? And that's probably, in terms of U.S. history, by far the best known, or the most notable anti-war movement, but it's certainly by no means the first, or maybe even the most effective. I mean, there were people who criticized the War of 1812, people who criticized Indian removal, white people who criticized Indian removal. There was a lot of dissent over the Mexican-American War, including Abraham Lincoln. But in 1898, you saw the emergence of a large anti-foreign policy movement, an anti-imperial movement. I don't want to go into great detail. What happens in 1898 in a nutshell? What's the consequence of 1898?
Cuba?
The United States takes Cuba. What else? Philippines. Okay, so it becomes an imperial country. This is the first time. It's not like the first time the U.S. got involved in other places, because there's been trading traders all over the world, and essentially foreign policy in the main is conducted by merchants and bankers, not by armies. But in 1898, they used armies and navies, right? So you have this conquest of Cuba, of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Hawaii. That's not done. That's not done without a serious dissent. There is in U.S. history a significant line of anti-imperialism, probably best embodied by a famous quote from John Quincy Adams. I don't think I've said it in here. The monsters to destroy quote. Have I mentioned that yet? In 1823, and this is the guy who wrote the Monroe Doctrine. John Quincy Adams wrote the Monroe Doctrine for the president, David Monroe. And he was giving a 4th of July oration. Back then, the 4th of July meant something. It wasn't just, like baseball games and hot dogs and sales at Macy's or anything like that. There were those, one of the most famous speeches in U.S. history, Frederick Douglass, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." Is the best example of that. And in 1823, John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, gave a 4th of July oration, 1821, I'm sorry, and he was talking about the United States. He said, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." Those are the key. That's the key phrase. America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher of the freedoms and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Should the U.S. adventure into other lands, he warned, she might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. All right? And in that, John Quincy Adams kind of lays out the anti-imperial line for really until today in a lot of ways. America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She's the well-wisher of the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Should the U.S. adventure, she might become I always say dominatrix instead of dictatress. She might become the dictatress, the dictator of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. What's he saying? What's John Quincy Adams saying there?
America will
Mind
lose
your
its
own
key.
business.
Well, it is mind your own business, but what's that?
America will lose its key competencies it's founded on.
Yeah, it'll lose its values. We should be happy that other people are seeking freedom, but our role is only to take care of our own. And if we do get involved in other places, what are we going to become? The dominatrix of the world, right?
Is anti-imperialism about the same thing as isolationism?
Well, we can talk about that. To critics, it is. Isolationism, there's a lot of words that have really negative connotations. In fact, I read an article last night ripping into Ron Paul for being an isolationist. Like one of the few things about Ron Paul I like. Isolationism has a historical context that basically means let's stay out of Europe's problems. Let's not get involved in the Napoleonic Wars, things like that. Not necessarily. I mean, isolation has many meanings. Anti-imperial. I mean, you can be an anti-imperialist and still want to be engaged in the world. Most people are. But the point is, let's be engaged in the world in kind of a more equitable, non-violent fashion. It's okay to trade, that kind of thing, but we don't need to be taking over Libya or invading Afghanistan or something like that. So yeah, I think there is a fundamental difference there. So you had this already in the Spanish-American War. I'm sorry, in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. There was a significant anti-imperial, anti-war movement, including Abraham Lincoln and Emerson and Thoreau and people like that. Now, American imperialism is different. So anti-imperialism is different. American imperialism isn't necessarily militarized for the most part. You know, the U.S. doesn't have a great empire like the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire, and the Russian Empire. You don't have Egypt or you know, India like the British do. You don't have Vietnam or Algiers like the French do. You don't have the Congo like the Germans do. You don't have parts of Asia like the Russians do. You don't have South Africa like the British do. The United States tends to get empire via free trade, and we've talked about free trade in the open door. So when it does move away from that into things like the foray into Mexico, the invasion of Mexico in 1846, you get significant dissent from it. And much of it is based on this idea that what it's doing is it's devaluing America's, you know, ideas, America's founding principles of freedom and of democracy and all that kind of stuff, right? And so by 1898, this is a fairly significant critique. And when the Americans begin to go into other lands, especially in Cuba, Puerto Rico, you have significant levels of dissent at that time. And just want to read a couple things here for you. This is something, I think I put this up there, I think I linked it, if not I will. This is something I wrote a long time ago. So by the 1890s, the United States takes over Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and all that stuff, based on the idea that the United States is seriously in need of resources. Right? Why is Cuba, for instance, so important to the U.S.?
Soil.
Soil, because you can do what in that soil? You can plant sugar and have plantations, right? The U.S. has always wanted Cuba. Right? Why is Hawaii so important? Military bases. There's sugar plantations here, but you also, I mean, how do ships? What kind of energy? What kind of fuel do ships use? The 1890s, coal, right? So, I mean, it's like a car. You can't fill up your car in Houston and drive to New York City. You have to stop along the way, right? So if you fill up your, you know, if you take off from wherever, Portland, or you know, if you want to go to Asia, you're going to have to stop along the way, and Hawaii is really important for that. It's a coaling station. So what this does is really provoke a significant criticism. A lot of people rejected kind of the social Darwinian application of American power. There's a lot of folks who are saying we need to bring. So, did you ever hear Rudyard Kipling, British author? You ever hear the phrase "white man's burden"? Well, Kipling and the British claimed that it's the same as manifest destiny. You know what manifest destiny is, right? What's manifest destiny?
It's the U.S. destiny to expand from one coastline to the
And
other.
who's telling you to do that?
Politicians.
It's bigger than that. It's God. Yeah. It's like, you know, it's your destiny, and you can't avoid it. It's your destiny, right? If it's just something your destiny, then you can't get away from it, right? So the white man's burden is the same thing. It's basically saying that as white Anglo-Saxons, we have to bring civilization to these, you know, little brown brethren, the heathen Chinese, whatever kind of racial appellation you use on these folks. Etymologically, the Europeans referred to non-white peoples generically as niggers. So niggers encompass people from Asia, people from Southern Europe, people from Africa. And so there's this racialist connotation to this too. We have to bring some kind of civilization to these people because on their own they'll never be able to do it by themselves. They're just not advanced enough. Well, a lot of American critics of that really spoke out, basically saying that, you know, you have no right to civilize other people. In fact, we have problems here at home that we should be taking care of. In the 1890s, you have Haymarket and Homestead and all that stuff. And also, there's this sense that this would pervert America's principles. William Jennings Bryan, we'll talk about it at more length in a minute, said that there would be a just resistance, that it would be just for people to challenge America's role in going into their countries. And I don't know, are you familiar with what happened in the Philippines after 1898? This is fascinating because this is really a far better, I think, comparative analysis of current wars than like Vietnam. You know, when Iraq broke out, because I studied Vietnam, it's just like Vietnam. You know, everything's like everything. It's their war of conquest. But the United States goes into the Philippines in 1898. They shell Manila Harbor, and then they take over. Did that end it? What happened then?
They lose 200,000 soldiers.
Yeah, a Philippine resistance, a Filipino freedom movement, which had fought against the Spanish, just essentially continues. And it's led by a guy named Emiliano Aguinaldo. And Aguinaldo, for 10 years, fights against the U.S. President, the U.S. Marines. Aguinaldo and the Filipinos lose over 200,000 men killed. The Marines have over 10,000 killed until the thing is finally settled around 1910. Few people know of that, but that's really instructive because what you see happen in Iraq is really similar to that, right? Does anybody know who the biggest critic of that was? If there's one person who stood out, I mean, in U.S. history, he would be the greatest anti-imperialist. We talked about him last week, Gilded Age, I think you. Mark Twain. Twain became, by far, the greatest voice of anti-imperialism in U.S. history. And in particular, he was offended by what was happening in the Philippines. He wrote a lot of stuff about Aguinaldo. He called him the Joan of Arc, the George Washington of the Philippines. And he wrote a great deal about it. Now, one thing I want to play for you here, it's one of Twain's, and Twain was a real smartass. He was like, you take the best of like Bill Maher and Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and Chris Rock and all these guys, and you ain't got Mark Twain. I mean, the guy's incredible. And so he wrote a lot about this. One of his most famous, actually, though, and he didn't like religion all that much either, but one of his most famous is called The War Prayer.